How are the older adults in our communities being treated behind closed doors? Elder abuse is a topic that's not talked about enough, yet it is a reality for many, cutting across various cultures and families. It is a topic that does demand our attention, compassion, and understanding. Today, I'm honored to have with me Dr. Rose Joudi. She is a wealth of knowledge in the field of psychology with a specialized focus on aging and ethnic diversity. With over 15 years of expertise, Dr. Joudi serves as the research lead for an ethnocultural Elder Abuse Awareness Project. With Carya in Calgary, Alberta, her work is pivotal in shedding light on the nuances of elder abuse and fostering a society that respects and protects the dignity of our older adults. In our conversation, we talk about what constitutes as elder abuse, the unique challenges that different ethnocultural communities face, and the surprising findings from her research. We explore the role of family caregivers. She shares her practical advice for professionals and families, guiding us on how to recognize, address, and prevent elder abuse. Join us as we learn how to contribute to a safer, more compassionate world for our older adults. Here is my interview with Dr. Rose Joudi. Hello, Dr. Rose Joudi. How are you?
I am great, Nicole. It's always great to see you.
It's so good to see you. Thank you for joining me again. Our listeners don't know, but I think by the time this one comes out, our other episode that we recorded together will also be out. But in our conversation, I was like, I need to have you back. We have to keep talking about these important conversations. And please share with us, for people that might not have heard the first episode, just a little bit about you, how you got into this work, and yeah, tell us more about that.
Oh, absolutely. It's always, I think, a great experience and an opportunity to be able to share some of the conversations that I think, you and I know might be the difficult ones, the uncomfortable ones, and to be able to have conversations about them so people could be confident and comfortable to have them as well. My background is I have a PhD in psychology, and I focused on older adulthood, and also ethnically diverse older adults. Being a child of immigrant parents, moving into a Western society at a very young age, I realized that the resources and supports that are put in place for aging, healthy aging, older adults didn't necessarily meet the needs of people who are linguistically and culturally diverse. And because we are becoming this one big global village, and immigration, as well as, of course, displacement for many refugees,
Mm.
has occurred, what's happening is that they're moving into cultures and societies that are culturally, traditionally, linguistically different from theirs, and they're
Mm.
staying there and they're growing older there. And they're raising their children, or they're bringing in their aging parents. And so it was just an observation that I had as I was growing older, that my parents spoke a different language, and their cultural views of particular things were quite unique and different. And in my mind, I was thinking, I wonder how they're going to grow older. I wonder what their needs going to look like as they age. Are they going to want to speak in their own language? And if I'm not around, because of that obligation that I feel I have towards my parents to look after them, if I'm not around, how are they going to manage? And who's going to provide that support for them that meets their needs? And so it became almost like a mission for me to be able to talk about it, as well as address other sensitive topics like elder abuse as
Mm.
well, right? And talking about older adults who are in situations where, again, they're linguistically different and culturally different, but they're experiencing the same challenges as any older adult would, such as being mistreated or neglected, etc. And so this whole interest of mine about aging and older adults who are ethnically diverse just came out from my family, and but they're also looking at the way that the world is, right now, and will continue to be.
Right. Yes. And we have such a unique and beautiful multicultural community and diversity. And so being able to have conversation about it, acknowledge it, talk about it, bring awareness and into the light of all of it, I think is Just so important. And I'm so glad that you're doing the work that you're doing, which is why I wanted to highlight it and share about it. And you're right, there are some harder conversations. One of those today that we're having revolving around elder abuse. And I'm sure language can also be another hurdle to cross within that as well. So, how, if we're going to set context and talk about what that is. What constitutes elder abuse? Why is it important? Why is it a critical issue for families and caregivers to understand, even healthcare professionals?
Elder abuse is one of those topics that we know happens, or the experiences that we know happen, but we as a society tend to not feel comfortable talking about it. Not necessarily because we pretend it doesn't exist. I think many people and a lot of your listeners are very intelligent, and they are very aware that these things do occur. It's just that we are not taught as professionals and as a society how to address it the best way possible. And we kind of get distracted by the other stuff. And I think sometimes the uncomfortable conversations, as we're distracted from them, make us feel okay about them. And so, elder abuse, interestingly enough, actually, Nicole, my current project that I'm doing with Carya, where I'm working right now, actually looks at ethnocultural communities and how they talk about elder abuse, because it seems that linguistically and culturally diverse people might not use the same words to
Mm,
express that they're being mistreated, because elder abuse in itself um, is because the translation and the interpretation of that word to many languages is quite heavy, and it's quite scary to even think that this is happening to an older person that you love, and that you wouldn't want any harm done to. And so, elder abuse from a Western perspective or a Western definition is any mistreatment
mm,
that is occurring towards an older adult. So it's doing and it's preventing the doing, really.
yeah.
Um, and so, which means that you could experience elder abuse as a result of the physical, financial, sexual, medicational, neglect, spiritual and religious, psychological and emotional mistreatment that occurs in a situation where an older adult and an adult is in a relationship of trust.
Mm,
And that trust is a result of the fact that the adult could be an adult child, which the majority of elder abuse cases are, or a caregiver, a family member who's a caregiver. But you're in a situation or a relationship of trust. You're entrusting this person to look after and meet the needs of this older person. But it's also the not doing, the preventing the abuse from happening,
mm,
right? That is also constituted as elder abuse as well. So if you know that an older adult is being mistreated or abused by a person and you're not doing anything, you're in this angle as well,
right.
because you're not actually preventing it from happening. And so it could be neglect, intentional or unintentional as well, which is not meeting the basic necessities of this person that you are in a situation or relationship of trust with them. So it's basically, in a nutshell, really, it's not providing the care, the respect, the needs, and meeting the needs of older adults. And it can be a one-time thing or it can be a continuous thing. So it's
Mm,
also not just the time frame, the occurrences also don't really matter. If you've done it once, it doesn't matter. It still constitutes as elder abuse. And so in itself, that even talking about that, and I know that because I do elder abuse awareness for community and organizations, it makes people cringe. It makes people feel so uncomfortable because even the thought that this is occurring in our society and we're really not well equipped to know how to handle it makes us uncomfortable.
right. It does. How prevalent is it? What do you see in the data that, just to put some tangible numbers in front of us?
So, what we know, which is not much really,
Mhm.
we don't really know much because it's a topic that people are quite concerned about reporting,
Mm,
especially when it's an older adult child, right? You are, as a parent, reporting to the police that your own child is abusing you and mistreating you. And we know that if as an older adult, if you were going down that road, you know it's not going to end up nicely for your adult child. And
Mm.
so, because it occurs mostly by adult children, it is heavily underreported. What we do know from what I would consider very outdated statistics is 1 in every 6 older adults over the age of 65 experience elder abuse. And these are reported cases, which
Wow.
we know that we don't have the right numbers and
Right.
that it does happen more often than we like to think of or feel comfortable acknowledging. And the fact that it goes underreported tells you that as a society, we're not really well equipped to either identify what elder abuse looks like, because I think that's another challenge that we have. We need more awareness in our society about what elder abuse looks like.
Yeah.
And especially when we're talking about linguistically and culturally diverse people, they're bringing in their own views about relationships and treatments.
Mm.
And therefore, they could be treated in a particular way, which in their eyes culturally is not elder abuse, and vice versa. It could
Mm.
be elder abuse in their cultural perception, but in Western law and in Western society, it isn't. And so these things go underreported because of lack of understanding of what elder abuse is or isn't, as
Right.
well as the fact that the concern is if it's an adult child, we know that we're not likely going to report it.
Oh, it's so true. So interesting. And with your extensive background in psychology, aging, ethnic diversity, what motivated you to focus on elder abuse specifically?
You know, it's one of those topics that as I was talking about it to my class at the university, and so teaching at the university, we do talk about elder abuse quite a bit. And
Mm.
I did realize in the past 16 years of being a professor in at the university is that students, younger adults in particular, they don't tend to address particular topics that might not be impacting them yet.
Mm.
And I don't want to say that they will never do that. I think they will. I do believe that the younger generation are growing to become quite more aware and wanting to live in a better world, in a better society. But sometimes you're in the moment as a young adult where you might not have that necessarily need to expand and go beyond what is impacting you right now. And the interesting thing is, as we're talking about why we are an age fearing society in Western society and the problems with ageism and these stereotypes that we have in our society, which is also things that I talk about in my class, I realized that when we put a lesser value on any group of people, we open the doors for us to be okay with them being mistreated and
Wow.
not being dealt with in a respectful or treated in a respectful way. And
Right.
so it almost made sense. Now
Mm.
I understand why we're struggling as a society to accept aging and older adults and put high value on a group of people that are continuously a productive group of people and a group of people that can still give as much as they can and want to. But when we're seeing them as unimportant, unnecessary, segregated, or needing to be segregated because they're not relevant anymore, then that isolation, that segregation and forceful isolation of older adults opens the door for them to be mistreated, abused, and then we won't know about it. I came across an article really in the early years of our pandemic that actually talked about the problems that we had with the rise of elder abuse and the forced isolation and social isolation and segregation of older adults to protect them. But in fact, what was happening was that we didn't know if they were being abused or the only people that were seeing them were the abusers.
Mm.
We weren't even checking in on them because our thoughts that we were protecting them, right?
Right.
By taking them away from society as such. But also at the same time, the article said that elder abuse and ageism are actually two faces to the same coin.
Interesting.
When you put a lesser value on a group of people, you make it okay for society to turn a blind eye to them being mistreated and abused.
You articulate that so well. And I actually really had never thought about the correlation between the two. And so highlighting that, I think, is going to really change our perspective on looking at those two things together. Like you said, two sides of the coin. Absolutely. So interesting. You, with your work, can see how elder abuse manifests differently across ethnocultural communities. What unique challenges do you see the differences that present in identifying, right? And then how do we address that with those different cultural communities?
So I think that's a great question because I think that's one of my biggest challenges, I think, is that Western society that we live in, whether it's Canada where I live in or the US where you live, and even in Europe, I think our systems historically have been systems that cater to the needs of a particular group of people.
Right.
That's why when immigrants do come to our countries, when we have that beautiful diversity of individuals, our systems are still lagging behind in understanding and figuring out how we can cope now and how can we um, provide the same resources and same supports at that same level to people who are different.
Mhm.
And I do believe that we are becoming quite more aware and cognizant of the need for us to adapt and adjust and be quite open-minded about acknowledging and respecting that people have differences in how they think and how they navigate this world, but we can still live together in harmony and actually work together and love each other.
Right.
And so when it comes to this conversation about elder abuse, I think what I tend to always go back to is what are the resources that we provide people who are white, Western, European, Caucasian?
Mm.
And how would that look like for somebody who doesn't speak that language or come from that same culture? And so what I do is I look at what are the resources and supports that a person, regardless of where they come from, would need and lean on in times of distress and challenges. And then I go, okay, how can we adapt and use those resources, those tools that this person comes with? Because I believe in the need for us to look at individuals, regardless of who they are, from that strength-based lens,
Right.
looking at what they do bring with them as opposed to what they don't bring with them and what we can provide because we think they have a need that we can fill. I think it really always is important for us to look at the person first
Mm.
and ask them what they bring and what they have. And then we work backwards and go, okay, how can we use what you have told me and you brought to the table in order to make your aging experience, your relationships, your way of navigating the world, one that works for you?
Mm.
That is how we are using that kind of strength based lens and that person directed and then centered
Yeah.
approach.
Yeah. So important. And you had talked about the research that you are working on right now and having it be the Elder Abuse Awareness Project. What findings surprised you or challenged your assumptions? I'm so curious about
Well,
that.
I'm going to share this with the world before I actually write the report, um, but I love having these conversations, Nicole, because I think it is I have an obligation, an ethical and moral obligation to, as an educator, as a researcher, but it also as someone who is concerned about the well-being of people, is that as I come across these findings, these interesting understandings, that I have an obligation to share them along the way rather than keep it a secret to the end, because sometimes there's no benefit in that, I think. So this project that I'm doing with Carya that focuses on these nuances and the way that ethnocultural communities talk about um, and manage, I guess, what I would call unhealthy relationships, right?
Mm.
And this, I think that in itself was an understanding and awareness that I gained after embarking on this project, is that ethnic people don't feel comfortable with you telling them you're going to talk to them about elder abuse.
Mm.
And because, like I said, that translation, that literal interpretation translation doesn't fall nicely on their ears, and it makes them think really horrible thoughts.
Right.
And that makes any person, community uncomfortable to even think that you are here to talk to us about this really horrid topic. And so I realized that when I approached ethnic communities, I came from a door of um, I want to support you to live a healthy aging life and experience. And these are the things that would help communities and older adults age in a healthy way,
Mm.
including healthy relationships. And so then I talk about, what do healthy relationships look like to you?
Mm.
And then we have that conversation. And then and only then do I say, there are examples also of unhealthy relationships. And one of those unhealthy relationships that an older adult might experience, regardless of ethnic background, socioeconomic status, education, etc., is elder abuse. What does elder abuse look like in your community, and how does that how is it translated? And so I learned, Nicole, to gradually talk about a very uncomfortable topic. And sometimes it required me to go in a couple of times until they trusted me, until I built rapport, until they knew my genuine intention was not to just extract information and data from them, but it's really to benefit them. And actually it's to gain knowledge from them, as opposed to me coming and going, I know what you need and you don't need. And so I was greeted with smiles, and they loosened up a bit, and they had these conversations. They talked to me. Ethnic communities talked to me about elder abuse. And I'm grateful for that, because I realized, we tend to go in, like I said, from that deficit lens sometimes, as not-for-profits or as agencies, with good intention, thinking that we're going to come in and fix a problem that this particular cohort or community has. But what we forget to do is they don't know who we are. And many of them come from cultures in which trusting authority, or people who have, let's say, that imbalanced power dynamic, is they don't automatically open up to you. They're very cautious, right? They don't know what your intentions are. And that could impact the quality of information they give you. And so I realized that, yeah, you have to be patient. You have to put effort into it. You have to genuinely want to help and assist, but also be willing to be quiet and listen and learn from them as well. And so they told me that most of them don't actually use the word elder abuse. They talk about mistreatment. They talk about disrespect. They talk about not honoring the older adult that they would back home. So the interpretation and translation of elder abuse didn't necessarily equate to the same words in their culture. And that helped me understand that what particular ethnic communities actually need in order to feel honored and safe and protected is actually providing them with that same cultural respect that they expect. But also, I realized that the family unit is such an integral part of their healing process, that I had some older adults who, yes, said we're being mistreated, financially abused by our adult children, but we don't really want the support for us. We want you to support our adult child, because they're the ones that have this problem. And if you help them, then they won't mistreat us.
Yeah.
So that's a parent sacrifice right there. Don't
Really?
help me, help my child. And so I realized that the family isn't, an important component in the healing process in elder abuse for many ethnic communities.
It is. And it's again that conversation of how important language is and the words that we use. That's such great insight to be able to take terms or words that would make sense to that person, like using mistreatment or respect. And you built that relationship and that foundation so that they would open up, and you listened and you had conversation. And so it's just a great reminder for us to continue to do that and have an awareness of that. I think sometimes we want to go in and use the language that we know, and this is what we need to do, but being able to be flexible and understanding that there are such differences based on the different people that we work with and the personal side.
Absolutely. And you do that as well when you're working in senior living too. You build that connection with the person in order to understand, how can I better meet their needs, and what can I do that would make sense to them, that would help them thrive in this community or situation that they're in, right? It's always about being curious about the person that you're working with or supporting, and understanding what is it that they need from me, as opposed to what I think they need from me, and what is it that I have to offer, as opposed to then asking, what would you like me to offer for you? What is it that would work for you? And it could be, and in particular with elder abuse, because it's such a sensitive topic, it could be things that they don't necessarily want you to do right now, but just the understanding and this perception and knowledge that there is somebody who cares about them,
Yeah.
and wants them to be safe, I think will mean a whole lot to people, because there is somebody who's thinking about you and your safety and wants you to be protected and live the best life. that you possibly can. And I think just that knowledge, sometimes it's just a business card that you give them, say, whenever you're ready. And I think that's another important thing, is it's not based on our timing. And when we think it is the right time for them to leave this environment, it's about their timing. Again, giving them agency, giving them control, giving them, the tools that will equip them to do this when they're ready. And again, I go look at senior living. It's the same thing. You're not forcing them to move into a community. You're giving them the knowledge, the pamphlets, the cards, or whatever it is, to help them make that decision themselves when they're ready. And in itself, that makes them trust you even more, that you are actually looking out for their best interest.
I agree. Yeah, and the reminder that there's an advocate on their side, right? When they're ready and when that timing happens. I also look at, okay, the role of family, right? Family caregiver, you talked about that relationship. It really is about looking at healthy and unhealthy relationships, which I love. That's going to stick with me for sure. How do family caregivers play a role in both, maybe potentially perpetuating that and then also preventing elder abuse? How can we better support families?
And you kind of, yes, you hit the nail on the head, as they would say, in terms of providing the support. There's absolutely never an excuse for elder abuse. However, we are looking at research right now that is saying perhaps when we're looking at the stress that people experience in life, that could vary depending on your coping mechanisms and personality and what you're going through, your own chronic conditions, your own relationship problems, your employment challenges that you're having. And then on top of that, there's this cultural expectation that you are looking after an older person who's also dealing with their own challenges too. And add on to that if you have children, for example. And so it becomes this just big loop of whose needs am I supposed to meet first, right? And how about my needs as an adult child? And how can I look after myself, right? And we always say that you're no good to anybody if you're not looking after yourself, and if you're not good to yourself too, right? And so even though there's never an excuse for elder abuse, the research is looking at, for example, could it potentially be that adult children who are caregivers for their aging parents are not really being supported? And we know that there's always a lack of funding and resources anyway. They're not being supported well enough and equipped with the tools that could help them navigate these complex systems, but also be educated about what help they could provide for their parents. It would be a lovely idea to believe that all adult children, if they wanted to, could look after their parents, but this is really unrealistic. Not all of us have the same coping mechanisms or even educational background or knowledge on how to look after our parents, especially if they have complex needs.
Right.
But some adult children might, they might put a lot of pressure on themselves to do that, especially when you're an ethnic person and you have that filial obligation because your ethnic community says that is your job as an adult child. And shame on you if you don't do that. And I think a lot of this shame and stigma in ethnic communities is also one of the reasons why elder abuse is underreported, because the parent feels ashamed, right? Because this is my child that I raised. So the shame is on me. But it's also the adult child who doesn't want to be shamed in the ethnic community for not looking after their parent, as cultural expectations are expecting them to. And so they put a lot of pressure on themselves to have to look after their parents when they are not well equipped to do that. So I think, again, when you're looking at caregiver resources and supports, they need to be diverse in terms of understanding that not all caregivers are alike in terms of what their needs are. Your ethnic caregivers could have and will have needs that are different than your white Caucasian caregivers. And it's not a one size fits all. You can't just give the same resources to all caregivers and go, this is going to work for you, all of you, right? Which is why some of our ethnic caregivers feel like they have to fend for themselves because this concept of providing resources and supports for ethnic caregivers is also new in some situations.
Right.
Because back home, it literally is the village that looks after the older adults. It's the adult children, but it's your aunts and uncles and your nephews and your cousins and your neighbors. And so you didn't necessarily need a social system to help you do that, right? Because the
So
community, the societies was equipped to do that with you and for you. But then you come to Western society, and it is very individualistic. It
true.
is that you have, and if you wanted this help, you have to go to this, down this route and down to this system and apply and fill in forms. And imagine, you know, coming from a different linguistically and cultural background and needing to navigate these new systems and figuring out what's best for yourself, but also your parent.
Right. Oh my gosh, such a need for that. The language is different. What our needs are so different when you're in an ethnic community. And so I could see how frustrating it would be when you're looking for that support and that help, and it does not resemble what your story is,
And
right?
I just,
How do you
and I
do
just
that?
and I just wanted to add one thing actually that you just reminded me of
Mm.
when you said the words, right? So even when you translate caregiver from English to any other language, and let's say Arabic, because I speak Arabic, it caregiver means that you are a person who is hired to give care, which means that there is no relationship and connection with the
Interesting.
not family. You're hired as an outsider. And I think in itself, that is a disrespectful term to use
Mhm.
in that language, but I could only imagine it how it's interpreted in various other languages, right? So it's
Interesting.
almost like I'm not a caregiver. I'm the child. I'm a family member, right? And so that makes me think also of Tipa Snow and how she would use care partner as opposed to caregiver as well, right? Because
Right.
there's this relationship, there's a two-way. And so yeah, and so when I talk to my parents, for example, and I, you know, I speak to them in Arabic and I say caregiver, my mom was like, why do you keep on saying caregiver? You know, it's you're not a paid hired
Mm.
worker. You're a family member. This is an obligation. This is how we are. This is how the culture is. And so even that translation. So you might have some ethnic people who, when you say, well, we've got resources for caregivers, they might not know that this is actually resources for them because they
Right.
don't identify as being a caregiver in their language when it's interpreted.
I'm so glad you talk about that. I never considered that. And caregivers, right? Family caregivers don't already typically identify, right, as a caregiver. They're like, I'm mom, I'm daughter. Oh my gosh, I'm just like, I have so many thoughts running through my mind. Well, what word do you prefer to use then in your culture? What would encompass what that means?
Oh, I actually just use family member.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's what you are, right?
Right.
Like
Right.
we have too many labels. That's the reality of it. We don't need to make things complicated.
Mhm.
So even when I do, let's say when I talk about elder abuse in Arabic to Arabic speaking communities and groups, and we do talk about caregiver burnout and caregiver stress, I actually just use a family member who is looking after
Right.
an older parent or an older family member, right? I mean, yeah, it's drawn because it's a a one word in English could be a whole sentence or three words in English, or
Yeah.
three words in a different language. But at the end of the day, it's important that you don't offend people and you make them feel what are she's talking about? We're not caregivers, right? So it's important to always not offend people and use respectful words that helps them connect with you as opposed to putting them off.
Yeah. I'm gonna remember that. Thank you. You're just so wise, so insightful. What is happening that you're seeing more from a community action, policy changes to better protect those older adults from abuse or raising that awareness?
We don't really have
Mhm.
policies yet to protect
Mm.
against elder abuse, and that's so unfortunate.
Oh,
And
unfortunate.
I speak on behalf of Canada. I'm not really sure and privy about how the policies and laws are in the US, but we don't really have a law that protects older adults from elder abuse or a policy as such, which I think my hope is that we will eventually, and I do believe that we will. However, with that being said, I think there's a lot of community-based and um, grassroots, not-for-profit work, and many people are very passionate and dedicated to this particular topic and these conversations. And hopefully, the more we talk about it, and the more that we're not just talking, but we're figuring out what to do. And the figuring out bit has to be this conversation that we have with the target audience, with the communities that are potentially either vulnerable to being abused, or they're just part of our community. And it's so important to go, if this happened to you, how would you want yourself or your family or loved one to be protected? What is it that we can do to encourage people to report elder abuse? Or how can we, I mean, because I asked that question to ethnic communities, I actually said to them, how can we encourage ethnic communities to report elder abuse? And I almost always had the response of, well, you can't do anything because we're not willing to report it if it's an adult child.
Right.
So then I said, I respect that. So what can we do as a society then to protect and make older adults feel safe and supported? Right. And that's when you are more likely to have that open conversation with them. And it's usually, again, looking at what makes an older adult or an ethnic community vulnerable to being targeted and abused, and taken advantage of. It's isolation, it's language barriers, lack of social connections, right? That also could impact isolation, unhealthy relationship management, and how to manage unhealthy relationships, financial support, housing support, right? So those are the things that I hear quite often being repeated, regardless of the ethnic group that I'm talking with. And so the community-based action support has to come from the community, because you're asking them, what do you need from us to help you maintain a healthy relationship or an aging experience, and to remain safe and feel safe and supported and protected? And so that feedback should come from them. And it is an obligation as a society for us to provide those and as best as we can and meet those needs.
Right. Yes, I did a podcast. It's not out yet, but we talked about having access to interpreters and health equity and being able to understand, right? Because if we have an incredibly beautiful, diverse culture here, specifically in the US, is what my lens is, but we also need to then have the availability and access to be able to understand our care. Otherwise, we are more isolated. We are not able to communicate what is going on in our world and just the importance of that. So I'm glad that we're just continuing the conversation.
Absolutely. And I think, like you said, the interpreters and trying to provide that support to avoid that language barrier is super important. But I think the interpreters also need to be well equipped and educated in the backgrounds of the cultures of the people that they're talking, with,
Right.
for. But I wouldn't like to do the for thing. But yeah, I'd say with, right? Because even in those particular settings, you do want the healthcare professional to talk and have direct eye contact with the person, regardless of them speaking English or not with the interpreter, right? And this is just best practices. If you have a person who speaks a different language, you're not talking as a healthcare professional to the interpreter. You're actually talking to your client or your patient, and you're maintaining eye contact with them. The interpreter's job is to be close to the ear of that person and then interpret and translate.
Yeah.
But you're not talking to the interpreter, you're talking to your client or patient. That shows that you understand that this person has agency and independence and competence to make their own decisions, even though they can't communicate that in the English language, let's say.
Right.
But also at the same time, with those interpreters, it is important to, with interpretation and translation, it is important to understand what level of knowledge and education does your client have? right? Because some of them could be illiterate in their own language, and so they can't read it or write it, which means that you'd have to have, skip the whole pamphlets and flyers and paper and stuff like that, but
Right.
providing them with audio or verbal information might be very, very helpful. Um, and then again, you'll have clients who, because of the language barrier, you don't want a family member to be the interpreter, because then that breaks that whole privacy and confidentiality relationship that you have with them. They might not want their family member to know especially if they're being abused. I mean, and again, this is something really interesting that I found that sometimes occurs, is that your adult child will come to you with as an interpreter to, an appointment that you have, and then you're asking them if you're being abused.
Right.
Of course, they're not going to say they are. The person who could be abusing them is with them doing the translation. And so that's why I would never recommend to have a family member as an interpreter or a translator, but to have somebody who does, ideally, who does not know the older adult, because then you have that also concern is, if it is the interpreter that you always use, who is part of the same community as your client, the client's concern is, will they start spreading that information that we've shared, even though you know that there's this confidentiality agreement that you have. But your clients might come from a background where, again, trust is earned, and it's gained from interaction. It's not something that you say from the first session, you can trust me, or you can trust your interpreter. And so, yeah, language is such an interesting thing. You'd have clients, for example, who won't use psychological and emotional words to express that they're unhappy, sad, or depressed, but they'll use somatic symptom words, right? They'll say, my chest is tight, my head is always throbbing. And that's because it's culturally more appropriate to use somatic symptoms to express your psychological experiences. So you really need a professional and an interpreter that actually picks up on those things and doesn't see them for what they are, but they're almost reading between the lines.
Mm. So interesting. That is such a good point. Well, and extending on that conversation, when you talked about the words used, how do we recognize what some of those signs are for elder abuse? How do we address that?
Yeah, and that's again another great question, Nicole, because when I do work with organizations and um, professionals who work with older adult clients, I actually do ask them that question. How would you know that your client is being abused? What are the signs that you know? And that helps me understand what kind of knowledge base is this professional working from, and how can I provide them with more knowledge in order to help in the identification component. And the reality is, this unrealistic expectation that your client is going to openly say, I'm being abused, is not likely to happen in most cases. I don't want to say it's impossible to happen, but I would say that the majority of your older adults will not tell you, at face value that they're being abused, but they might say things like, I'm not comfortable. I don't get out often. Or I think it would be very smart of the professional to say things like, how often do you get out? What is it that you like to do? What is it that you enjoy doing back home? And are you doing that now? And if not, how can we provide that for you? Are you eating well? What's your diet like? Knowing that you have health conditions. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to gain a better understanding of what's happening in this environment that you don't know much about.
Mhm.
And you're trying to get your client to talk to you, and it's almost like you're an investigator. You have to be curious, and you have to word the sentences in a different way that you can still get quality information from, that then you can maybe deduce some
Mhm.
potential conclusions from, if they're not coming to you saying that they're being abused. So things like, do you enjoy shopping, and what is it that you like to buy, and how often do so it's things like that, right? So depending on what you think potentially could be happening, is it financial abuse, is it sexual abuse, is it emotional and psychological abuse, is it neglect, right? So as a professional, and that's why I said it takes dedication, and it takes patience, and it takes time, to even want to do that. But if you're a professional who wants just to have clients go in and out, or you've got a checklist of questions that you're asking every single person, you're not really going to, yeah, that's not due diligence, I think, in my opinion. And you're not going to really understand what's truly happening to your client. And so it's really things like that. Physical abuse is very obvious, clearly, but some of your older adults might be hiding them with long sleeves, for example, right? Because I think there is this knowledge from perpetrators and potential perpetrators that the face, being the obvious part of the body, will not be touched. The other parts of the body that could be covered might be touched and abused. And so it's not just about going, oh, if I don't see the abuse, then it's not happening. You can't see emotional and psychological abuse.
Right, right. To your point too, when you had talked about looking at the person, looking at the cultural setting, that will guide our questions, right? Like that'll guide our curiosity rather than just, like you said, having the same questions for everyone all the time. That is not due diligence.
Absolutely.
Yeah. For those that are maybe concerned about elder abuse, either for themselves or someone that they know, where would you direct people? What resources are available? What first steps would you recommend?
The first steps that I would recommend to any person or community is to be able to acknowledge and um, identify that they are being abused or that your neighbor or friend is being abused. People, when they're in social settings, sometimes might think or feel like they're not important or they're not seen,
Mm.
especially if they don't have family members to check in on them. They're not part of it. They don't have a social system that is quite strong. And that truly breaks my heart, knowing that we don't see particular people. And I don't just mean physically seeing, but visually. I mean seeing what's happening to them and trying to understand inside of them what is happening to them. And so I think the first step is to be able to see our community members, have, build, I think, I'd love to see something like build a network of people from the community who check in on older adults who we know need to be checked in on, almost like do a community watch, right? Where sometimes we do that in senior living. If we don't have an older adult who comes out of their room in a day or two, we go in and check in on them, right? Or if they don't have a little sign on the door that says good morning, they haven't flipped that sign, we know that they haven't, woken up in the morning, so we need to check in on them. And the same goes for people who live and are aging in our community. Having a network of people, if they're part of a social group, if they're part of a spiritual, religious group, if we're not seeing them that day, and we know that they might need a check-in, then to do that. So to acknowledge the fact that elder abuse could happen, I think is very important. To admit that it's happening is very important, because sometimes we won't want to do that, right? Because it's very hurtful and it's sad to know that this is how we're being treated. And then after the acknowledging and the seeing that it's happening, then it's trying to find ways to come out of that the best way possible. And by that, I mean, it could be that you talk to somebody about it, right? Someone that you trust. Because again, that could be the first few steps, just acknowledging that it's happening. And then who is it that I trust in my community or my circle that I could just at least, and I've had clients who said, all I want to do is just tell you that it's happening, but I don't want you to interfere at all. But it just makes me feel the weight is a lot lighter when I at least say it, right? And so it could be those steps. It's building this this safe, supportive, non-judgmental relationship with somebody or a group of people where you can say this is happening. And then after that, going to, it's not just going to someone you trust, it's also going to someone that will have the resources. And I'm sure in the States, as in Canada, we have a lot of resources. We have various not-for-profits that particularly cater to the needs of older adults. And some of these resources would have, or these organizations would have a department or a team that looks after elder abuse. But if all fails, you call 911.
Mhm.
Really. I mean, if you have absolutely no idea what to do, call 911. Whether you know it's abuse or you're not sure it's abuse, I think it's better to err on the side of caution.
Right.
Call 911, and then from there, I'm pretty sure that they're well equipped to then direct the person to what the right resource would be like, whether it's a local agency or it's a religious spiritual agency that looks after older adults who are in that situation, whether it's the shelters that we might have. Ethnic communities might not want these shelters because again, it's a very obvious sign that something's happening in the family that they might not want to, have, under the spotlight. But it could just be phone numbers, it could be helplines, it could be social group gatherings that might just at least eliminate some of that isolation and at least get the older adult out of the home. So 911 would be my second option after the whole identifying and acknowledging, right? And then see where 911 takes you. Here in Canada, we have various hotlines. We have a health link line, for example, that we can call, even though it's a health link, mental health, emotional, psychological health is part of that as well. And so they could also direct the older adult to the right resource. But in fact, when I do elder abuse awareness training, I say, if all fails, call 911.
Mhm. Thank you. And we'll include those links in the episode description too. I'll make sure to get some of those from you, and people can easily click and be directed to where they need to go. I think it's important, right, that we've got access to information and resources that can support us. So, yeah, it's important. Thank you. And looking ahead, what do you believe will really make a difference as we're fighting elder abuse? As we, and a lot of our conversation today was around the cultural competency, right? And having awareness of that. So, how are you hopeful? What do you see happening in our future here?
I really do believe that we are becoming a lot more courageous in having these difficult conversations. Again, it's not one of those light, happy topics to walk into and say, I'm going to talk about elder abuse, right? Or mistreatment, or elder mistreatment, or unhealthy relationships. But I'm finding that because we are seeing a growing number of older adults increasing statistically globally, we as a countries, even a planet, I think we're realizing that there are particular topics that we shied away from in the past because we didn't necessarily think there were going to be problems. But now we're realizing, because we are seeing a growing number of older adults, an increase in older adults and a decrease in younger people, that there are going to be more and more of these unhealthy situations. And what are we going to do about it? And it's not necessarily now, it's also for the future generations, right? We want to pave the way for them to be able to be protected, feel safe, be supported. We do that for children, and we need to do that for older adults as well. So I am very hopeful that more people are open to having these difficult conversations, because if we don't have these difficult conversations, we will never find solutions to them.
So true. And it is the awareness of that intersection too with our view of aging, right? So ageism connected to that, right? Where what lives in the dark doesn't have the light shine on it. And so it's important that we do that and create the world we want to age in, right? And live in and for a future. So I appreciate you. I appreciate your thoughts and your insight. And it is just so thinking through so many things today that really has honestly changed my perspective on how I view this whole topic. So I appreciate that. And I know our listeners will too. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me again, Nicole. It's always a pleasure. I love these conversations with you.
Me too. Thank you. Thank you. We did it. That was
Thank you so
great.
much.
Oh
Yeah,
my,
I love this.
thank you. I love it too. And I truly learned like there were so many things that you said today that were just like aha moments. So I know if that's for, my take on it, I know so many people are going to be just
Oh, I
learned
appreciate
so
it.
much.
Yeah.
So
like I said, when I go and going, oh, I'm going to talk about elder abuse, people are like, what? Of all the things,
Oh,
to talk about the lovely things that happen in aging. And I said, absolutely. But that's right now,
no,
that's not what I'm going to do. Right.
it is.
But
It
then,
is.
but then you say, okay, well, it could be part of the process. Yes,
Mhm.
I want us to have a beautiful, lovely aging experience.
Right, right.
How do we fix the challenges that could become barriers to achieving that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And build awareness around it.
yeah,
So we can't all just have the fluffy conversations because, as lovely as they are, like you said, if you don't shed light on it, it will
yeah.
always be in the dark, and we will always be very confused and scared about
Right,
the unknown,
right,
right?
right. Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree. And I like being able to have the hard conversations. I think it's so important. I do. Yeah. Thank you.
You.
Thank
Well,
you
I hope
for
the rest of the week goes
joining.
really well for you.
Thank you. You too.
Oh,
You
it's
too.
always so lovely to see your beautiful
Oh,
face.
me too. I love it so much. Are you looking for another encouraging podcast? Let me introduce you to my friend Elizabeth Miller, the host of the Happy Healthy Caregiver podcast. She visits with family caregivers and dives into their caregiving and self-care strategies. She also highlights that family caregivers are the experts in caregiving. Beyond the informative conversation, Elizabeth reveals the tried and true resources and practical self-care tips that empower caregivers to prioritize their health and happiness. You can find the Happy Healthy Caregiver podcast wherever you download your favorite podcast or go to her website, www.happyhealthycaregiver.com. Thank you for listening today. If you enjoyed our episode, please subscribe and give us 5 stars. In all honesty, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening to our episode.